At 60 years old, I had 2 suitcases. $47 and some change. And one thing my husband forgot to take when he left. He took the house. He took the car. He took the bank account we had built together over 32 years. He took the furniture, the good dishes, and the painting from our living room wall that his mother had left him. He took everything a lawyer could put a name to. But there was one thing he didn't take. One thing he didn't know about. One thing that had been sitting quiet and still for 40 years, waiting for exactly this moment. And that one thing, a broken-down bakery on the edge of a town where nobody knew my name, was about to become the rest of my life. My name is Dorothy Price. I was 60 years old, completely broke, and completely alone. And what happened next, what I built with nothing but a last dollar and a name nobody believed in yet, is the story I have been waiting to tell. Stay with me. Because the part that will surprise you isn't how I survived. It's what he did when he found out. Before we dive deeper, if you are new here, subscribe and tell me where you are watching from. I will be giving shout-outs to some of my newest subscribers in my next videos. I'd love to welcome you personally. Now, before we go back to the beginning, I need you to hold 3 questions. Question 1. How does a 60-year-old woman with $47 and no plan buy a bakery? The answer involves a conversation with a stranger, a broken door lock, and a recipe written on the back of a paper bag that changed everything. Question 2. What did my ex-husband forget to take, and why did he forget it? The answer to that one goes back 30 years to a secret I kept inside our marriage. A secret that probably saved my life. And which he never once thought to ask about. Question 3. What happened when he found out what I had built? That answer, the one that made me understand that justice doesn't always arrive loud and angry, sometimes it arrives quiet, on a Tuesday afternoon, in a bakery that belongs entirely to you, that answer is the reason I'm still telling this story. Keep those 3 questions in your mind. We're going to answer every one. But first, you need to know who Dorothy Price was before that Tuesday in October when she stood on a sidewalk with 2 suitcases and a marriage that had just ended. You need to know where she came from. What she survived. What she had already learned to do with her hands before anyone told her she was worth anything at all. I grew up in a town so small it didn't have its own zip code until 1987. Millhaven, Georgia. Population 940. 1 stop sign. 1 diner. 1 church that doubled as the town hall for anything that required a microphone. My grandmother ran the only bakery Millhaven ever had. She opened it in 1959 with a borrowed oven and a jar of sourdough starter she'd been feeding since she was a teenager. She called it Birdie's, after herself, Bernadette Mae Weston, who everyone had called Birdie since before she could remember. Birdie's wasn't fancy. It was 6 tables, mismatched chairs, and a display case that fogged up from the inside on cold mornings. But it was the kind of place that people came back to. Not because they had to. Because something there reminded them of something they couldn't name. I spent every Saturday of my childhood in that kitchen. I learned to tell when bread was ready by the sound it made when you knocked the bottom of the loaf. I learned that good pie crust is more about temperature than recipe. I learned that people who are suffering need something sweet and something warm and something made by a specific pair of hands they trust, and in that order. My grandmother taught me everything. And then, when I was 19, she died. Birdie's closed. The town bought the building and turned it into a small library. And I left Millhaven with a cardboard suitcase and the absolute determination to live a different kind of life. A modern life. A life that didn't require getting up at 4 a.m. to start the ovens. I met Gerald Price when I was 22. He was into sales. He wore a good watch and drove a car that was too new for a man his age, and I thought that meant he was going somewhere. He was. Just not somewhere I wanted to go. We married at 24. We moved 4 times in 8 years, wherever his job took us. Raleigh. Tampa. Columbus. A suburb of Columbus that we lived in for 11 years and which I could not describe to you today because I never fully arrived there. I worked, early on. Administrative jobs. Part-time accounting when the children were small. And then, slowly, as Gerald's career grew and the household required more management and the children required more attention, I stopped. I became the woman at home. Which I thought I had chosen. And maybe I had. Or maybe choosing and drifting look identical from the inside until one day you look up and realize you can't remember the last decision you made entirely for yourself. There was one thing I never told Gerald about. Not because I was hiding it exactly, more because it had never come up. When my grandmother died, she left me one thing, a small plot of land on the edge of Millhaven. The land Bertie's had sat on. The building was gone by then, sold to the town. But the land itself, the actual ground, was mine. Deeded to me in a document I had placed in a folder inside a box inside a storage unit I paid $32 a month for, every month, for 38 years. Gerald never asked. I never mentioned it. I filed it away in my mind under the past and got on with the business of being Mrs. Gerald Price. 32 years of ordinary. And then, on a Tuesday in October, when the light was the way it gets in autumn, that specific low gold that makes everything look like a memory, Gerald sat down across from me at the kitchen table. He had something in his hand. He said it between us. And 32 years ended in the time it takes to slide a manila envelope across a table. He didn't fight about it. I didn't either. We had grown so good at not fighting about anything that we had forgotten how to fight for anything. A lawyer divided 32 years into columns. His column was considerably longer than mine. On a Tuesday in October, I stood on a sidewalk with 2 suitcases. $47. And a storage unit receipt for a plot of land in a town I hadn't visited since I was 19. I didn't go to my daughter's house. She was in Portland, and her apartment had 1 bedroom, and I was not about to become someone who took up space in another person's life before I understood what space I was going to take up in my own. I didn't go to my son's house. He was in Dallas and newly married and navigating something of his own that I didn't want to complicate. I went to Millhaven. Not for any good reason. Not because I had a plan. Because it was the only place I could think of where nobody knew me as Gerald Price's wife. Where the only version of me that existed was the one from before him. I took a Greyhound bus. Then a smaller bus. Then a taxi driven by a man who was older than me and who asked where I was headed and accepted, somewhere in Millhaven, as a complete answer. The town was different. Of course it was different. 40 years is long enough for everything to change shape. New houses on some streets. A CVS where the hardware store had been. A Mexican restaurant in a building I didn't recognize. But the bones were the same. The grid of streets. The old water tower. The way the afternoon light came through the trees at the end of Main Street. I found a room in a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Adele Crane who charged $40 a night and did not ask questions, which at that particular moment was the single greatest gift any stranger had ever given me. I paid for 1 week with my $47. This left me with $7. $7 and no plan. I found it on my second morning. I wasn't looking for it. I was looking for a coffee shop. Instead I found a building I had walked past 1,000 times as a child, now abandoned, its windows papered over, a rusted for lease sign propped in the corner of the door. Millhaven Bakehouse. Not Bertie's, that had been a different building, a different corner. This was someone else's old bakery. A stranger's dream that had outlasted whoever had dreamed it. I stood on the sidewalk and looked at it for a very long time. And then something happened that I still can't entirely explain. I tried the door. Not because I intended to go in. But the way you sometimes test a boundary, a locked gate, a closed door, just to confirm it is what it appears to be. The latch gave. The door swung inward on a creak that went through the whole building. And the smell that came out, flour dust, old wood, the ghost of something sweet underneath it all, went straight through 40 years of my life and landed in my grandmother's kitchen. I walked inside. The display cases were still there, cracked glass and all. The counter still ran the full width of the back wall. The kitchen behind it, I could see it through the half-open door, still had a commercial range, dusty and cold, but bolted to the floor and clearly still connected to the gas line. It smelled like something that had given up. It looked like something that hadn't, quite. I stood in the middle of that empty room for, I don't know how long. Long enough for the light to shift. Long enough for the silence to stop feeling like abandonment and start feeling like an invitation. And then I did something that, by any rational measure, made absolutely no sense. I went to find the owner. The for lease sign had a phone number. I borrowed Mrs. Crane's telephone. The number rang 6 times and then connected to a man named Howard Briggs, who was 81 years old, whose late wife Edna had opened that bakery in 1961 and run it until her arthritis made the kneading impossible, and who had been paying property taxes on the building for 11 years since it closed because he hadn't been able to bring himself to sell it. You want to lease it? What for? I want to open it back up. Silence. You know anything about running a bakery? I know everything about running a bakery. I just haven't done it in 40 years. More silence. Edna would have liked that answer. Come by the house. We'll talk. The rent Howard Briggs asked for was so low I thought I had misheard him. When I repeated the number back to him, he nodded. I don't need the money. I need to know someone's in there making something again. Edna's place deserves that much. I shook his hand. I had $7. And I had just agreed to lease a bakery. If Dorothy's story has you gripping your seat right now, type, "I'm with Dorothy," in the comments. Let's see who is writing this all the way to the end. Let me be precise about the starting conditions, because I think it matters. I had $7. I had a signed lease on a building that needed cleaning, repairs, and restocking before it could produce a single item for sale. I had no equipment, no supplies, no local connections, and no credit history in my own name, because for 32 years, everything had been in Gerald's. I had my hands. My grandmother's recipes, which I carried entirely in my memory because I had never needed to write them down. And a stubbornness that I had been told my whole life was a flaw and which I was, for the first time, beginning to suspect was actually an asset. The first thing I did was call my daughter. Mom. What do you mean you leased a bakery? I mean I signed a lease on a building. I'm going to open a bakery. Mom. You haven't baked professionally since. I baked every day of our lives. I just wasn't charging anyone for it. Patricia drove down from Portland. She was furious and terrified and proud in a way she hadn't figured out how to say out loud yet. She brought $1,200 in cash. Do not tell me to keep it, Mom, I'm not keeping it, and spent one long weekend helping me scrub 40 years of closed time out of that building. We worked from 7 in the morning until we couldn't stand up. We swept and scrubbed and replaced 2 cracked display case panels with new glass Patricia found at a salvage yard 40 minutes away. We repainted the front wall. We cleaned that commercial range until it gleamed, and when we turned on the gas and the pilot lights caught, both of us just stood there for a moment. It worked. The oven worked. I stood in Edna Briggs's kitchen with my daughter beside me and I put my hands on that range and I felt something I had not felt in 32 years. I felt like I was in the right room. I used Patricia's $1,200 carefully. Flour, sugar, butter, salt, yeast, the fundamental architecture of everything. Jars. Labels. A used cash register from a thrift store that required 2 hours and a YouTube tutorial to figure out. I opened on a Thursday. I had made 4 loaves of sourdough, 2 dozen cinnamon rolls, and a single peach pie, because it was October and the last of the season's peaches were at the farmer's market 2 blocks over and I could not help myself. I put a handwritten sign in the window, "Open. Fresh bread today." I stood behind my counter and I waited. The first customer arrived at 7:45. A man on his way to work who smelled the cinnamon rolls from the sidewalk and couldn't keep walking. He bought 2. He paid with a $10 bill and told me to keep the change. By noon, everything was gone. Everything. I stood in my empty bakery and I counted the money in the register. I had made $112. $112. From 4 loaves, 2 dozen rolls, and 1 pie. In a single morning. I called Patricia. How'd it go? I sold out by noon. Silence. Mom. I need to be up by 4 tomorrow. By the end of the first week, word had begun to move through Millhaven the way useful things move through small towns, quietly, person to person, without announcement. The woman at the bakery makes real bread. You should go before noon or there won't be any left. By the end of the second week, I had a wait list for the peach pie. By the end of the third week, I had to add a second baking session in the afternoons to keep up with the demand for rolls. I woke up at 4 every morning. I baked through the morning. I sold through the afternoon. I cleaned in the evening. I fell asleep in the chair by the window more nights than I want to admit. My knees ached. My back ached. My hands, which had gone soft and idle over 30 years of not doing exactly this, were cracked and flour-dusted and slightly swollen most mornings. I had never been happier in my life. Not performing happiness. Not managing it or hoping it would arrive later. Actual happiness, the kind that lives in your body, in the specific ache of work that means something. After 6 weeks, I hired my first helper, a 17-year-old named Cora who came in after school and on weekend mornings and who learned faster than anyone I had ever watched. I paid her $12 an hour and all the day-old pastries she could carry, and she accepted this as though I had given her the world, which in some small way maybe I had. I was building something. Day by day, loaf by loaf, I was building it. And I had not yet told a single person in Millhaven about the land. 3 months after opening, the lease on Edna's building came up for its first renewal. Howard Briggs came by in person to sign the new papers. He sat at one of my 4 tables. I had 4 tables by then, mismatched chairs, which somehow looked deliberate, and had a cup of coffee and a slice of the apple cake that had become, inexplicably, the thing people drove in from other towns to get. I've been meaning to ask you something. Ask. You're not from around here currently. But you feel like you're from somewhere around here. The way you move in that kitchen. Like you've been in it before. I told him about my grandmother. About Bertie's. About the Saturday mornings on the step stool. He was quiet for a long moment. Bertie Weston was your grandmother? You knew her. Edna and Bertie were friends for 40 years. From before either bakery existed. They used to swap recipes through the fence between their yards. I sat down. I didn't put it together until just now. You have her hands. He looked at my flour-dusted hands on the table and something crossed his face that I could not name, something between recognition and relief. Bertie left land around here somewhere, didn't she? I remember Edna mentioning it. Said Bertie always believed the land would come back to the family when the family was ready for it. I went back to Mrs. Crane's that evening. I called the storage facility where I had kept a box for 38 years. I asked them to open it and read me what was in the deed document inside. The plot of land my grandmother left me was a corner lot. On the corner of Main Street and 5th Avenue in Millhaven, Georgia. The corner where, in a building that had been demolished before I was old enough to remember, Bertie's had originally stood. The corner where, if I were to build something, there would be room for a proper commercial kitchen, a larger display floor, and a second story that could be used for almost anything. The corner where, if I read the current property assessments correctly, the land was worth something now. A great deal more than nothing. I didn't call Gerald. I didn't call his lawyers. I called mine, the one Patricia had found me in Atlanta, the one who had helped structure my divorce settlement. Dorothy, the land was never part of the marital estate. You owned it before the marriage. It was listed in your original premarital assets even if no one thought to look there. It is entirely yours. Entirely mine. Gerald had taken everything he could put his name on. But he had never put his name on this because I had never told him it existed. My grandmother, standing in her kitchen in 1959 with a borrowed oven and a jar of sourdough starter, had given me more than recipes. She had given me a foundation. She had kept it safe inside a deed in a storage box for 40 years, waiting for me to be ready. And I was finally, completely, irreversibly ready. I hired an architect. I applied for a small business loan, with the land as collateral, which my attorney assured me was a straightforward transaction. I drew plans on paper napkins at 4 in the morning after the bread was in and before the customers arrived. I was building a bakery. Not Edna's bakery. Not a rented space. My own. On the ground my grandmother had set aside for exactly this. If you knew this was coming and still got chills, drop a comment right now. Tell me what hit you hardest in this story so far. Dorothy's Bakehouse opened on Bertie Weston's corner 14 months after I first walked into a crumbling building on Main Street with $7 in my pocket. It was not a grand opening. There were no photographers, no ribbon cutting, no speeches. There was a handwritten sign that Cora had made, she had beautiful handwriting, Cora, and a line of people that stretched around the corner before I unlocked the door at 6:30 in the morning. Some of them I recognized from the first weeks at Edna's. Some were new, people who had driven from neighboring towns after hearing descriptions of the apple cake or the sourdough or the peach pie from September that someone had mentioned to someone who had mentioned it to them. Howard Briggs came. He sat at the table closest to the window, the same way he had always sat at Edna's. He had a coffee and a cinnamon roll and he did not say much. When he left, he shook my hand and looked at me with the expression of a man who has watched something incomplete become whole. I had 3 employees by then. Cora, who had turned down a summer job at the mall in Columbus to stay and learn the apple cake. A woman named Ruth Ann who had run a restaurant kitchen in Birmingham for 20 years and who had walked in one morning asking if I needed anyone who understood heat. And a retired schoolteacher named Mr. Briggs, no relation to Howard, who came in on weekend mornings to pour coffee and talk to customers because, he said, he missed having people to talk to. I paid them fairly. I paid myself fairly. I had enough to cover everything and a little more every month, enough to bank, enough to plan with, enough to feel like the ground beneath me was solid and mine. He came on a Saturday in April. I recognized his car from the window, not the car he'd had when we were married, a newer one, which somehow made it worse, the way new things acquired after a divorce can feel like evidence of something. He parked in the lot across the street and sat inside for a few minutes before getting out. He looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I had grown. He walked to the door of Dorothy's bakehouse and stopped when he read the name. I watched him read it. I watched his face. Then he came inside. The bakery was full, a Saturday morning in April, every table taken, Cora managing the counter while Ruth Ann ran the kitchen and Mr. Briggs made his slow circuit of the room refilling coffees. The smell was bread and cinnamon and the faint sweetness of something in the oven that would be ready in 20 minutes. Gerald looked around the room like a man trying to understand a language he had never thought to learn. I came out from behind the counter. Dorothy. Gerald. Do you want coffee? We sat at the only open table, a small one near the back, and I poured the coffee myself and put a cinnamon roll between us because I was a baker and that was what I did. I heard about this place. Someone at a conference mentioned Millhaven. Said there was a bakery here that people drove 40 miles for. I didn't. You didn't think it would be mine. I didn't know you had family here. You never asked. He was quiet for a moment. I want to talk to you about something. About the building. I've been looking at some investment opportunities and the property values in towns like this. I set down my coffee cup. Gerald. Just hear me out. If you were to take on a partner. The land is mine. The building is mine. The business is mine. There is no partnership to discuss. He looked at me. And I looked back. Not with anger. Not with triumph. With something much quieter and much more complete than either of those things. You took everything you could see, Gerald. You took 30 years of shared life and you divided it into columns and you took the longer one. And that was your right. I don't hold that against you anymore. But this. I looked around my bakery. The full tables. Ruth Ann's hands moving in the kitchen. Cora laughing at something a regular had said. Mr. Briggs pouring coffee for an elderly woman who came every Saturday. This was never yours to see. So you couldn't take it. And you can't partner with it now. Gerald sat with that for a long moment. I made a mistake, Dorothy. I know you did. Not just the business thing just now. The whole thing. The way it ended. I thought. I know what you thought. A beat. But I want you to hear something, Gerald. I'm not angry at you. Not anymore. Maybe I should be, maybe I earned the right, but I'm not. Because if you hadn't done what you did, I would have kept waiting to do this. I would have kept telling myself, after the kids are settled, after things slow down, after some later version of right now. I looked out the window at the corner where Bertie's had stood. At the building I had put on ground my grandmother had kept safe for me for 40 years. You pushed me out of a life I was only half living. And I found my way back to something that was mine before you ever knew my name. He didn't answer. After a while, he ate the cinnamon roll. He drank the coffee. He left a $20 bill on the table, which was more than he needed to, and he stood up and put on his coat. It's a good place, Dorothy. I know. He walked out through the front door. The bell above it rang once. I picked up the $20, set it in the register, and went back to work. Dorothy's bakehouse is still open. Cora runs the morning shift now. She is 23 and learning to manage inventory and she has her own notebook of recipes that she adds to every week, the same way my grandmother did, the same way I did. Howard Briggs died 18 months ago. He left me, in his will, Edna's rolling pin and a handwritten note that said, "She would have been glad it was you." I framed the note. It hangs above the register. My daughter came for Christmas and didn't leave until February and I didn't ask her to. My son brought his family for a week in the summer and his youngest called me Grandma Dottie for the first time and I cried in the kitchen where no one could see. I am 62 years old. I get up at 4 in the morning because I want to, because the quiet of the bakery before anyone else arrives, with the ovens warming and the first loaves going in, is the most complete silence I have ever known. I live in a house 2 blocks from the bakery. I planted a peach tree in the backyard. It hasn't fruited yet. I'm not in a hurry. This is what I want to leave you with. Not the idea that everything happens for a reason, I am not sure I believe that entirely. Not the idea that suffering is secretly a gift, I don't think that's honest. But this, the things that belong to you cannot be taken by someone who never understood what they were looking at. Gerald took a house. He could see the house. He took a car, accounts, furniture, everything his eyes could land on and his lawyers could name. But he could not take what my grandmother put in my hands on a Saturday morning in Millhaven, Georgia, in 1974. He could not take the land she kept saved for me for 40 years. He could not take the knowledge of when bread is ready by the sound of the bottom of the loaf. He could not take the thing that knew, standing in an abandoned building, that this was the right room. Those things were never his to see. So they were never his to own. And they were always, always waiting for me. Whatever is waiting for you, I hope you find your way to it. Even if, especially if, someone first has to push you out the door. Now I want to hear from you. What was your grandmother, or your mother, or some woman in your life, what did she hand you that no one else could ever take? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And I have one more question for you to sit with. Do you think Dorothy was right to let Gerald in that Saturday? Or would you have closed the door? Tell me what you would have done. Let's talk about it down below. And if this story moved you, next week I am bringing you something that will hit even closer to home. A woman at 58 who was told that her diagnosis meant she had 2 years. She spent those 2 years doing the one thing every doctor told her not to. And she is still here. She is still here, and she wants to tell you why. Make sure you're subscribed. Make sure the bell is on. You do not want to miss that one. Thank you. Truly. For sitting with Dorothy. Some stories need to be told slowly, carefully, all the way through, because that is how they were lived. This was one of them.